Jessica, and welcome. Today we'll be talking about digital competence and youth well-being, a topic that's becoming more important than ever as young people navigate online. We're joined here by Dr. Jessica Piotrowski, an expert in media psychology and children's digital development. Thank you for being here. To start, could you please introduce yourself and share a bit about your work, particularly around digital competence and youth well-being?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me. Jess Piotrowski. I'm a professor at the University of Amsterdam. And at the University of Amsterdam, I hold multiple different hats, so to speak. As a professor, I run our graduate school here, so I'm training the next generation of scholars or helping training them. But as a researcher, I spend quite a bit of time understanding how young persons are growing up in today's digital world. So my professorship is as a communication in the digital society. And I'm really trying to understand what's happening as the digital space evolves and how are we thriving or not in that space with particular attention to young persons. There's a lot of different research projects I lead right now. A large one is monitoring digital competence here in the Netherlands and trying to understand how young persons, but actually all of us, are digitally competent or where we're struggling and what that means for what comes next.
Okay. How do you define digital competence and why is it essential for young people today?
Yeah, so I use the European Commission, the EU's definition of digital competence since I'm situated in the EU, and I focus on the skills and knowledge necessary for engaging in the digital world. That would be a short version of a long academic definition. And I think what's important about that is these two components, both the knowledge of what's happening in the world around us and also the skills we need to do that. And I think what's often sort of misunderstood in the digital competence space is we often think of it as perhaps one thing, but it's much more than one thing, right? So we often think of it as yes, I'm competent or no, I'm not, but it's more nuanced than that. So my research and my team's research has really identified 11 different domains of digital competence, ranging from the skills you need to critically reflect on information, to the netiquette or the way you engage in the digital world around you, to your ability to create in the space, keep things private and safe, to your health and well-being and onward. So it's really far more complex than any one indicator. And you can be quite skilled in one space, but struggle in something else. And what I'm trying to understand is where we are strong and where we struggle and how we can help.
Interesting. So I see that there's, a bit of momentum or growing momentum around restricting or even banning, social media and, youth having access to social media. Are there any sort of risks that you see in those types of approaches as it relates to, digital competence? Or, conversely, are there any benefits where limits can be helpful?
Yeah, and the ban language is certainly taking force. I think the last thing I looked is that there's 14 different countries in some way discussing bans as it relates specifically to social media and young persons, often under the age of 15, but that's a little bit different per country. So this is complicated, right? This is a complicated discussion for multiple reasons. One, it's a complicated conversation because it's starting with data that's not entirely accurate. So we have an argumentation that started this dialogue that social media harms mental health and well-being, mental health and mental well-being. That is not precisely accurate. There is a struggle with with mental well-being in young persons. That is true. And young persons are struggling in the social media space as well in many ways. But the correlations and the relationships between these two are nearly non-existent. But we feel this problem, right? There is something going on. And so there's a reason that people react and say, I need help. And my own research shows that parents are absolutely calling for help. They're struggling with how to support and regulate in the space. I am not a proponent of full out bans at all. I will say the evidence on not having phones, for example, in the classroom is quite clear, right? When kids should be learning math, that's a moment to be having them focus on that. There's really a quite clear argumentation for helping young persons regulate their phone use, for example, in schools. But banning social media altogether, I don't see any evidence for. In fact, what I see is that bans, especially with young persons, end up usually backfiring. One, young persons end up in less safe spaces that maybe are sort of missing the regulatory framework. They will find a way, so to speak. That worries me. Two, I'm not really sure if we remove it, that what we effectively do when they can suddenly have access, if we've taught them anything. We haven't given them the skills to really be prepared for the space. So what I see is often there can be more harm than good by fully banning, but a real healthy discussion about helping them navigate the space and having the digital skills, the digital competence to navigate the space is certainly worthwhile. And I think this needs to happen. And as much as I'm not for the bans, because I see no evidence that banning will fix the problem, I do think that it is highlighting problems and giving attention to it, and that I find important.
And I guess a question that I have is, what does, teaching digital competence look like in practice? You gave a few examples, but for educators, for schools, for platforms, what does it look like?
Yeah, well, it looks different for each of those different spaces you just mentioned. So I think what happens in the schools, there's so many places where it can be built into the school system. But one, teachers need support, right? We need to train teachers on how to do this, and we need to give them the financial support and the space to do it. I would never suggest that there should be like a class on digital competence. It's really all day in what they're doing. So you can encourage digital competence skills when they're making presentations by helping them create video content or create PowerPoint, for example, or slide decks. You can encourage discussions about safety and privacy when they get their Chromebooks in schools, where you talk about passwords and two-factor authentication and you discuss what this means. You can discuss when young persons are getting smartphones at the smartphone acquisition, policies on sharing information. What is safe to share? What don't we share? Why don't we share that? What to do when something goes wrong. So you cover safety and privacy of devices, and you cover problem solving, helping a young person. What happens when something goes wrong? There's discussions to be had, we call it just-in-time information. When in the moment are they confronted with this tech, and how can we help them in that space have the knowledge and skills they need to give them agency here? And that means in the classrooms, there are spaces where tech falls in a general discussion point. How do we talk to one another? How do we engage with discussions where we disagree? What does that look like? That's helping with netiquette, for example. How do we find well-being? How do we explain to young kids why we have no smartphone at this moment and help them talk about balance and what that looks like? If you're in a digital space, how can you create a platform that naturally explains to young persons, this is why you're seeing this, and what you can do about it to have agency to change your feed, for example, help them understanding AI or algorithms. Not burying things that happen when you maybe have something negative happen to you, but make it very easy to report.
Yeah.
And creating this space where well-being of young persons is part of this. So it's not education in any one space. Digital competence is formed by our experiences with the digital world and learning from them. And young persons are confronted with it in every different area of their life, in many cases in Northern Europe and US, for example, and other more privileged countries around the world for sure. Also really globally, we're seeing this happen. So how do you meet them where they are and help them in the moment get the knowledge and skills they need for thriving?
What about policymakers? What can policymakers do?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, and I talk a lot with policymakers right now. I think it depends on where we're sitting for this. So, for example, policymakers have the ability to put on the agenda certain things that matter. So they have the ability to put on the agenda. We think digital competence matters, and we'd like to see it in the school systems. And we want to make sure that teachers are supported in this. One of the things I don't want to see is more work for people without resources to do it. That always feels really problematic for me. But they can surface that. They can talk. They can also have conversations with the very platforms that our young persons are using, and really say, what are you going to, are you going to step into the ring and help here too? What are you going to do? And what role can you play in this? And really push on this a little bit. And they can also really set the agenda for researchers such as myself. They have the ability to say, we don't know enough about X yet, but we find scientifically guided decisions very important. So therefore, we're going to try to prioritize this and fund science in this space as well. They also have the ability to listen to the very constituents they support and hear really in a nuanced way, what do you need? My most recent research here in the Netherlands, I interviewed parents to hear what they're looking for help. And there is a sense that all parents want a ban. My research shows that about half of the parents do want a ban, but nearly all parents want help for themselves. They want schools to help them. They want platforms to do more for them. They range a whole list of other things where there's near unanimous agreement. I want all of this. Listening to the voices of the persons you represent matters a lot in shaping policy.
Amazing. So it sounds like you have to take a bit of a holistic approach to address this. With that said, what about cultural or, regulatory nuances, right? What children in the US are tackling, I'm sure is similar to what children in the Netherlands, for example, could be tackling, but I'm sure there are some differences as well.
Yeah, so I think in these cases, so for example, value systems matter a lot. Cultural value systems matter quite a bit. So young persons develop in certain ways. There's certain milestones. We know how they're developing. We know how their brain is developing. We know how they're processing information. But there are norms per culture to decide what is acceptable or not. And you need to, when thinking about, for example, classification systems for media content, right? If you think about how you classify media content, if you look at rating systems, traditional content rating systems across the globe, you will see differences based on age-based rating. So, okay, in certain countries we'll say, I feel this is okay now. For other countries, they're not yet ready. Or they will say something else is acceptable now. So in countries around the world where maybe sexual health is more openly discussed with young persons, the notion of sexual content, it might be that it's skewed, that it can be in a little bit younger content because they're sort of, well, this is a normal part of our dialogue. But for other countries around the world where sexual health or sexual practices are discussed or even considered at later stages as something you would talk about, they may be shaped differently on what people identify as acceptable or okay. And so I think in any system that is created, policymakers have to be also looking at what fits the culture that they're in. And there are dramatic differences and there are subtle differences. And that's also, again, where understanding the space you're working in matters a lot. And I find it incredibly complicated when you have global platforms that have to discern a policy often for all, when cultural barriers dramatically shape what is fitting.
Very cool. There's one piece that we haven't touched on, and it's the advertising community. How can advertisers contribute to this vision, right? Advertisers, they have, a lot of control and in this space and play a big part in this space, right? And how can the content that they fund, for example, or the messages that they amplify or don't amplify, right? How can that support digital competence or, increase healthier online engagement?
My colleagues who are more experts in youth and advertising, for example, I'm careful to give an age rating here, but they really talk about, there's a moment in younger childhood where it's just inappropriate to reach young kids because they don't understand that an advertiser has a goal, right? So this differs based on 8, 9 years old or something, but the younger audience, they really will not understand that someone has a goal for them that's different than their own goals, right? They don't have this understanding or theory of mind.
Sure.
And they don't have the ability to necessarily robustly resist it either. So for me, advertising has a line where I find it problematic when it feels unethical to me, when a young person can't resist it. As they get older and they're able to understand and define and be able to identify it, it feels to me part of the commercial system through which we're engaging in. Even there, for me, what's most important is that a young person can identify and have the ability to feel that they understand what's happening, right? So helping young persons means ethical advertising. It means advertising that fits the cultural spaces they're situated in. It means respecting their own developmental space and what they are able to do, and making sure that you don't take advantage of their developing neurocognitive systems, for example. I find that really important to be able to be sensitive to that. And I think it's also, for me, I'm always thinking, is this a product that's okay for a young person? Is this, or what are you suggesting for them to do? How are you reaching out to them? These are questions I ask. So I'm very honest when I say that I think there's a lot of thought that should go into how you reach young persons and when it feels okay and when it doesn't feel okay. So,
right. And that's the competence piece, right? Being able to understand that and to be able to distinguish those differences.
Yeah, and I find that in this space in particular, I really increasingly am worried about misinformation and disinformation in the digital space. It's getting increasingly hard to fact check.
For young people and for any age, right?
All of us, the ability to create content now that seems so authentic and so real, and the ability to then fact check it is getting increasingly complicated, and that worries me for the globe, right? That
Sure.
worries me for all of us, and therefore too, I find authenticity super important here.
Amazing. Yeah, I remember when I was back in school, right? And we were learning about what a peer-reviewed source was, and how to identify them. But as now that's just a base layer, right? There's so much that builds on that.
And the thing is, I'm looking at something like generative AI, where a young person can generate a video, for example, generative video content. On the one hand, as a creative digital competence skill, it's quite powerful to be able to use the digital tools at one's disposal to create video content. That is a digital competence skill. But an equally powerful skill is being able to say, this is not authentic. This is not real. It's created, it's fake, but that doesn't make it any less funny or whatever the goal was. And I think to myself, how do we check this? Because what happens is this information gets into the hands of others and gets spread very quickly. How do you have it watermarked or have the provenance maintained in such a way that you can identify who created it, with what intention, and is it authentic? And how do we help young persons know how to do that?
Sure. With that said, are there any evidence-based frameworks or best practices that you find most promising for helping young people navigate this?
Probably not one that stands out. I think what I'm noticing more and more though is that there is, if you look historically, and I've said this in other interviews before, every time something new comes out, we panic. We have a moral panic. We usually have fear. We usually ban. The ban doesn't work. We then find another way. We then begin regulation, and then we try to correct our mistakes.
Yeah.
A version of that. We don't have time to do that again. We got to find a new merry-go-round here. We got to try something different.
Sure.
And I think what we need to be doing is recognizing right now this idea of sort of constraining or stopping or banning or any of the words you might use where we really see that there's almost a control approach, right? So this real idea of sort of a blunt age ban. We're going to stop at this age. What will happen is you're going to have evasion, right? Kids will use VPNs. They will create new accounts. They will end up in less spaces. We will lose oversight of what's going on. They will likely sacrifice their own privacy in order to be able to access different things. You'll see massive differences in platform enforcement. You're going to see a lot of these from this control approach. If we lean in towards how do we help young persons become competent? How do we think about age-appropriate content? How do we make sure that these content build in features? How do we encourage, whether it's nudges or certain defaults or smart age verification? How do we label maybe synthetic content for authenticity and help young persons recognize that, give them the skills to do so? How do we target and enforce the bad actors, right? Really find the ones that are really problematic and make a point of that. How do we help put digital competence in the schools? How do we do audits of platforms when we're really trying to check? If we build it instead of stop it all, but more say, let's all lean in to make sure that young persons have the skills and knowledge necessary for the space. And that we expect that of platforms in their design. We expect that of content creators and what young persons can see. We expect that of policymakers when they're thinking of what to do. We think of this from families and schools, and we try to arm the different spaces. I think that version will work better. But what I recognize is it's an unpopular headline, and it feels really slow. When I talk to people about the ban, most of them say, look, I get it. A ban doesn't make sense in the long term, but we need to do something now until we fix things. And I can find myself in that argument because there is a real, are we taking action? What is happening? Are we making sure that the content young persons see, that they know what to do when it harms them? Are we doing it so that when they enjoy it, that we know that they enjoy it well too? Are we helping them think through what happens when they create content and share it? Do they know how to protect themselves? Are we engaging properly? So I understand while the naysayers say, if we banned it and we got it wrong, the harm's not so big. But if I trust you as the researcher and I wait and we don't move fast enough, haven't we caused more harm?
Sure.
I understand that sentiment. So I think a competence-based framework also means responding now and getting everybody on board now. And I'm not sure we'll get there, but that would be my hopeful framework, because I do believe that the control framework of stopping all is a bandage, but not a fix.
Sure. Taking it a step, outside of, competence, you touched on platform design and age verification, right? What about, children who shouldn't even be operating in these spaces? What does smart platform design and smart, age verification look like to you?
So age verification is a buzzword I think I'm hearing at every meeting these days.
Sure.
I am holding on to hope that this might help, but I'm not convinced yet.
Okay.
And I say that for two reasons. I think what I worry about is that people think this will be the holy grail. This will fix everything. We will have age verification. You will build that in the end. Age verification, the act of verifying one's age, requires a couple things. One, it requires that the country in place has digital identifications or some sort of identification. So one, not all countries have this, and two, not all young persons have access to identification. So the act of building that in automatically excludes those who may very well benefit from these spaces. Two, a lot of the current examples right now of age verification make errors. Right. And they make errors specifically on these sort of the pivotal moments, like the difference between a 13-year-old and a 14-year-old, or the difference between like these nuances. So if they use age inferencing techniques, where they maybe look at the face or they look at behavioral cues, they make errors.
Right.
Now, they do an okay job, but they do make errors. And these errors can, if we believe, oh, this is perfect, everything is handled, and we stop, we're going to actually miss both who's left off the boat, but also who got in accidentally, right? So there's discrimination that we see, an unintentional facial discrimination that happens, for example. We know for sure not all young persons have identification, so you're leaving those crew off.
Right.
And we create potentially a feeling of complete safety when that's not going to be a guarantee.
Yeah.
However, one of my friends calls it the Swiss cheese model. Can you build lots of different things so that the holes of one are covered by something else? Can you think not of it as one thing, but as what are the multiple approaches we take to support young persons in the digital space? I find that interesting, right? Thinking through what are the ways. So if platforms lean in, and I think some of them are to some extent, I'm not sure how many all of them are, and I'm not sure, sometimes I question like how much they're leaning in versus what they're doing just enough. Like if platforms truly lean in, there could be healthy dialogues about, they know how to bring young persons in. They know how to connect them. Like they've been designed with friction-free environments to bring young persons in. That means they also probably know or can find out, how do we support healthy disconnection too, when the well-being is at stake here? How do we find a balance? Young persons say over and over again to us, I need help stopping. So can you not only age verify or age inference and build that as one space specifically for certain types of content maybe, and I think a lot of conversations needs to be had about when, if this is used, where and how, but also think about other things like nudges on when to stop. Removing the classic infinite scroll that everyone talks about. It never seems to have an end. But what else can you do where you begin to really truly think, how do I help you find balance in the platform design? Look, the platforms were made to bring us on. Now my question is, we know that young persons are needing help stopping. We know that there's struggle content in there. And I don't believe a platform is ever going to be able to say we can get everything off. I don't believe that I think that is an unfair standard to hold them to. But I believe we can say, what are the things you do? Model it up and build multiple things together to create a healthy space for young persons, which means not only what you maybe gate off and don't allow in your platform, and maybe what you age gate in, but also the infrastructure you build so that when young persons, but maybe even all of us, when we go there and into these platforms and into these spaces, it helps us, especially young persons who are still developing, find balance.
Right. I love the idea of the Swiss cheese model, right? It's interesting because, going back to age verification, right? You can do facial scanning, or you can, share your identification, or you can have a parent support you in helping you get on the platform. But there are none of these are perfect solutions. You have to, consider all of them. And then, even on top of that, right? What about children's, who don't have parental support, right? Or who are already surrounded by perhaps like a negative or less than positive environment, right? We already know that outside of the digital space, these children fall through the cracks.
So then we're taking the kids who are already falling through the cracks and maybe even making it harder for them.
Sure.
And then, I always remind people, the UN Convention, the Rights of the Child, I know that people don't always remember this, but digital rights are part of the rights of the child. They have the right to be protected in the space. They have the right for provision in the space, so the skills they need, and they have the right to participate in the space.
Yeah.
And I think what we struggle with, and I understand the struggle, and as a scientist who's very nuanced and who often really, I wish I could always give simple answers, but I've never met a complex problem that has a simple answer. I see we often struggle between protecting young persons and helping them participate. This tension. How do we find this balance? This is a tension, and it's a dynamic tension. Because as the digital space evolves, new risks emerge, but new opportunities for participation emerge. And so I think we have to be careful to assume one moment, one solution fixes all. I think we have to recognize the complexity in the moment. And I think it is an all hands on deck. It is everybody committed to figuring this out. And that's why I think it's so hard. Because it's not, if we do X, this will all work. It's just not going to be that way.
Right.
But if we all do something, it will help.
Yeah. And to your point of this being all hands on deck, but before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts or any advice that you would like to share with the parents who might be watching, educators or other industry leaders to support, a more healthy digital development?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure who's listening to this one today, but I think there's different things and there's different audiences. I often look at parents, and I want to first recognize for parents, this is difficult. And I think that is something that parents, I want to make sure they're heard. I recognize it's hard. What you're doing right now, managing all of this, it's one more thing. I know it's incredibly difficult to be able to work with young persons whose natural goal is to pull away from parents in their teenage years to find a way to connect with them about these things. And I imagine and I know it's particularly difficult when you're maybe not using these platforms and spaces yourself to know how to guide. I really have been loving these actions of like parenting networks. In the Netherlands, we have something called the Cyber Ouders Network, Cyber Parents, where parents who maybe feel more confident can share with other parents what they're learning. I love the idea of ways that we bring people or parents together to normalize we don't have all the answers, but to actually encourage healthy conversations about how to help young persons. So one, I think for parents, I just want you to know I see you, and I know it's not easy. I think for policymakers, my message would be, please don't assume that simple solutions fix complex problems. They rarely do. I make a good headline. And I know the devil's in the detail on this. I know it's complicated, and here's where empirical spaces and scientists can help. And I think it's really, really important that they hear it all to be able to take decisions and support the constituents that they represent. And for the platforms, I think we're entering a space right now where trust in platforms is decreasing. In my own scientific network, what I feel that the belief that platforms want good for all of us is being questioned. That's by everyone. I have no scientific data to support that. This is my own personal feeling. This is me as a person, as a human. And I basically would say, if you're in it, step in.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Piotrowski, thank you so much for sharing your insights and for taking the time. It's been a fabulous conversation. We so appreciate it.
Well, thank you.